All right, thanks everyone. So the field of artificial intelligence has obviously made huge advances in recent years, and that's renewed interest in this question of what it would take for an AI system to be conscious, and that's why we're all here. So some believe that we're probably already pretty close to this point. So an open letter signed by luminaries, including Yoshua Bengio, Carl Friston, Susan Schneider, Michael Graziano, they assert in this open letter that it's no longer within the realm of science fiction to imagine AI systems having feelings and even human-level consciousness. But on the other hand, there are some philosophers and neuroscientists who argue that the nature of phenomenal consciousness is such as to preclude its realization in conventional computer hardware, so as to make that infeasible or nomonologically impossible or even metaphysically impossible. And I take it that the stakes in this debate seem like they're kind of high in that phenomenal consciousness is often assumed to be a necessary and perhaps even a sufficient condition for having moral standing or moral status. So in this talk, I'm going to be talking about an argument that suggests that this can't be so, that if physicalism provides the correct metaphysics for consciousness, then it doesn't matter to the moral standing of any AI system who's right and who's wrong in these contemporary theoretical debates about whether consciousness can be realized in conventional computer hardware. And very roughly, that's because if physicalism is common knowledge amongst the parties to the disagreement, then I'll suggest there's reasons to think that their disagreement is purely semantic, whereas I'll argue or suggest that the correct resolution of a purely semantic disagreement doesn't bear on whether any entity has moral standing. So I'll call this the semantic indifference argument. And since I take physicalism to be highly plausible, I take it that this is an argument that we ought to take seriously. So as I said, the argument that I'll present is premised on the assumption that physicalism provides the correct metaphysics of consciousness. So I take it physicalism is generally thought of as a kind of all-encompassing metaphysical doctrine, as the view that everything is ultimately physical, or that there is nothing over and above the physical. Narrowing our focus to consciousness, I will take physicalism here to entail, at least to a first approximation, that every phenomenal property is to be identified with some physical or some functional property. I include neurobiological properties within the class of physical properties, and I'm going to understand a functional property to be a second-order property defined in terms of possession of some first-order property or properties that play some particular causal role or roles. I'm also going to take it that this claim that every phenomenal property is identified with some physical or functional property to entail that every phenomenal concept co-refers with some physical or functional concept. Here I'm going to understand a physical or functional concept to be not only a concept that refers to a physical or functional property if it refers at all, but one that does so transparently, such that it's a priori for us that it refers to such a property if it refers to any property. So there is considerable philosophical debate about the best way to precify this thought that everything is ultimately physical. And so some might prefer to understand the implications of physicalism for the metaphysics of consciousness in a way that avoids commitment to the kind of property identity claims that are on the screen up here. So if that's you, don't worry. I'm going to discuss in due course whether rejecting this kind of property identity formulation might be a useful means of trying to resist this semantic indifference argument. But otherwise, yeah, this argument is supposed to help us sort of diagnose what's going on in certain contemporary theoretical disagreements about whether phenomenal consciousness can be realized in conventional computer hardware. And I'm identifying these disagreements as theoretical in the sense that they're not really concerned with engineering questions about what conventional computer hardware can do. They are rather disagreements about whether what it can do suffices for subjective experience, according to some preferred theory of the nature of consciousness. So on one side of the disagreements, you'll find adherents of computational functionalism who accept the kind of conclusions outlined in the recent expert report by my colleague Patrick Butlin and a whole lot of co-authors. So here I'm going to take computational functionalism to be a theory about the nature of the mind that entails that every phenomenal property is to be identified with some functional property, and also asserts that for every such property, there's some computation whose implementation entails the instantiation of that functional property. So what Patrick and his colleagues argue in this paper is that if indeed the implementation of some computation suffices for consciousness, and if we take scientific theories of consciousness, like the global workspace theory, as a guide to what those kind of computations might be, then they conclude that there are actually no significant technical barriers to the creation of conscious AI systems. So in the executive summary, they say conscious AI systems could realistically be built in the near term. And in fact, there's this paper that came out in 2024 in Frontiers in Computational Neuroscience, where Dosa and colleagues, they describe designing and training a multimodal agent architecture that they claim satisfies all of the computational indicator properties that are supposed to be associated with the global workspace theory, according to Butlin et al. So I think computational functionalists who like the global workspace theory should find it disturbingly plausible that conscious AI systems have already been successfully engineered. On the other side of the debate are philosophers who either reject computational functionalism in its entirety, or they insist that implementing the right computations to realize phenomenal consciousness requires meeting additional constraints that are unlikely to be met by programs that are run on conventional computer hardware. So on the one hand, there are some philosophers and neuroscientists who understand consciousness as having an at least partly neurobiological essence, and so they deny the possibility of non-biological consciousness. Probably the most famous, I guess, is Ned Block. But recent years have also seen a kind of increase in interest among philosophers and some neuroscientists in kind of functionalist theories that say that phenomenal consciousness actually depends on quite specialized aspects of the functional architecture of the animal nervous system. So probably the most famous is Peter Godfrey Smith, who argues for the significance of really fine-grained functional properties that reflect the way that animal nervous systems integrate computation and metabolic activity. Derek Schiller has argued that the realization of the key functional roles in a conscious computational system need to have a kind of physical integrity that the nodes of a neural network or an artificial neural network standardly lack, though they might have it if they were to be implemented in neuromorphic hardware. I think Tononi and Koch argue for a similar conclusion in this 2015 paper, which they take to follow from the integrated information theory of consciousness. Okay, so the semantic indifference argument is intended to support the claim that it doesn't matter to the moral standing of any AI system who is right and who is wrong in this kind of disagreement that I've just described, assuming that is that physicalism provides the right metaphysics for consciousness. And as I said earlier, the basic structure of the argument goes like this. If physicalism is common knowledge to the parties to the disagreement, then it seems that their disagreement must be purely semantic in something like the following sense. It's not about what the world is like, but rather what aspects of the world we refer to via our phenomenal concepts. The resolution of a purely semantic disagreement, I claim, doesn't bear on the moral standing of any entity. So it doesn't matter to the moral status of any AI system who's right in the dispute I just described. So my goal in this section is just going to try to present the argument in a way that makes clear why you might think some of the premises of this argument are plausible. I'm not going to try to make the argument absolutely watertight. I will try to do a little bit of that in subsequent sections of the talk where I'll respond to some objections. Okay, so the first premise, as I said, it says that if physicalism is common knowledge among the parties to the disagreement, then the disagreement is purely semantic. It reduces to a disagreement about how or to where phenomenal concepts refer. And to explain why I find this plausible, I'm going to tell a story about Alice and Bob. So we're going to assume that physicalism is, the truth of physicalism is common knowledge for Alice and Bob. And we'll imagine that one day they confront a sophisticated AI system, which I'll call Aurora. So I'm going to assume that Aurora is running on conventional computer hardware, so its underlying operations are implemented on one or more von Neumann machines whose cores are etched in silicon and so on and so forth. At the level of software, I'm going to assume that Aurora exhibits high-level computational properties of the kind that are supposed to be sufficient for consciousness according to one or more of the sets of criteria that are outlined by Patrick Butlin and Rob Long and their co-authors in this report. So for example, Aurora might have multiple specialized input modules that operate in parallel and rely on algorithmic recurrence and predictive coding to generate organized integrated representations that are subsequently fed to some limited capacity workspace. That workspace might enable all this information to be broadcast to all of the system's modules, might have a state-dependent attention mechanism that allows the workspace to query the modules and get them to perform complex tasks, might be equipped also with a kind of predictive model for representing and controlling the current state of attention. It might inhabit a detailed three-dimensional virtual environment, and it might have been trained via reinforcement learning to pursue goals within this environment, in part by modeling output-input contingencies. So that's the kind of system that we'll imagine. And we'll also suppose that Alice adheres to computational functionalism, and so she judges that Aurora is conscious because Aurora satisfies some suitable subset of the kind of indicator properties that I've just noted. By contrast, we're going to assume that Bob disagrees, so he doesn't think Aurora exhibits phenomenal consciousness. That might be because Bob believes that phenomenal consciousness is a neurobiological property, and so you need neural wetware to have it. But alternatively, he might believe that implementation of the right kind of computations for realizing phenomenal consciousness requires replicating certain additional fine-grained properties of the functional organization of the animal nervous system that Aurora fails to mimic. Now, crucially, Bob needn't dispute that Aurora satisfies the kind of high-level computational properties that Alice thinks of as sufficient for consciousness. And conversely, Alice needn't challenge the claim that Aurora is a non-biological system that fails to mimic certain very fine-grained properties of the animal nervous system. Right, so that's not the source of the disagreement. If it was, there wouldn't be all that much philosophical depth to it, you might think, and in some sense, it could just be resolved by studying the capacities of the system a little bit more closely. So we can thus imagine that actually Alice and Bob agree on Aurora's material composition and the functional organization of the system, as well as how its functional organization is like and unlike that of various animal neural systems that they both agree are conscious. But given that they agree on all that, and that they agree on the truth of physicalism, I think there is then this question, what does the disagreement between them really amount to? So what is Alice saying is the case with Aurora that Bob denies? Now, I think if we imagine that they both had common knowledge of the truth of property dualism, then I think the answer to this question would be straightforward enough, right? Alice would be asserting that Aurora exhibits irreducible phenomenal properties over and above the physical and functional properties that she and Bob agree that the system exhibits. By contrast, Bob would be denying that Aurora exhibits any such additional properties. But in reality, we are imagining or assuming that they both have common knowledge of the truth of physicalism. So they both agree that there are no and could not be any such additional properties in play. So as a result, I think it's not really clear what is in dispute. So it's not really clear what it is about Alice's picture of how things stand with Aurora that Bob thinks misrepresents some aspect of reality. So the first premise of the semantic indifference argument, as I've said, it asserts that this disagreement is actually semantic. And here's roughly why this strikes me as plausible. So for any physical or functional predicate concept F, we imagine that Alice and Bob are agreeing in accepting or rejecting the proposition Aurora is F. Moreover, we assume that it's common knowledge for them, that for every phenomenal concept, well, that just refers to some physical or functional property that could instead have been picked out via a physical or functional concept instead. So phenomenal concepts do not serve to introduce any additional properties. So for any phenomenal concept G, Alice and Bob disagree on the truth of the proposition Aurora is G, but they agree that there is some physical or functional concept that picks out the very same property, and indeed they will agree on the truth or falsity of whatever that proposition might be. So it's not a watertight argument, but I do think a very natural inference or natural assumption or hypothesis as to what's going on is the hypothesis that their disagreement is semantic. It must reduce to a disagreement about which physical or functional concept serves to pick out the same property as is picked out by the phenomenal concept G. And that's it. So their disagreement on this picture is not about what properties Aurora has, but which among the properties it's agreed that she has or doesn't have might be picked out by our phenomenal concepts. Now, although I've described this as a purely semantic disagreement, I've sort of consciously resisted using the label merely verbal because I think it has some connotations that I want to avoid. So for example, I'm not suggesting here that Alice and Bob are using the same words to express different concepts and so end up talking past one another. I am more or less assuming that all the relevant concepts are shared between them and that they really are disagreeing about the truth or falsity of one and the same propositional content. So by contrast, at least according to Ted Sider, disagreement over whether a sentence phi is merely verbal is merely verbal just in case the disputants do not mean the same thing by the sentence phi, and what one says by uttering phi is consistent with what the other says by uttering not phi. So that's not supposed to be what's going on here. I also take it that people who are involved in a merely verbal dispute are supposed to be failing to understand, ultimately, that their disagreement is merely semantics. They're sort of confused about the nature of their disagreement. But I don't want to exclude the possibility that maybe Alice and Bob know full well that ultimately they disagree because they disagree about semantic facts or meta-semantic principles. So I take it that philosophers of mind know all too well that certain disputes about the nature of consciousness seem to hinge on questions about the nature of our phenomenal concepts. So for example, in Thomas Hill's 1991 book, Sensations, where he defends a kind of chauvinist type identity theory that denies the possibility of consciousness without neurobiology, he's very clear that he thinks whether we should accept or reject such a theory depends ultimately on certain semantic issues, and in particular, he thinks that if any sensation concepts did have a semantic profile like that of theoretical concepts in the natural sciences, then those sensations could not, he admits, be identified with any neurobiological state. So we could imagine, for example, that Bob is Thomas Hill and Alice is his evil twin who accepts this alternative semantic theory, for example. Last but not least, I want to be clear that I'm not assuming that there's no fact of the matter about which among the candidate physical and functional properties in play might be picked out by the relevant phenomenal concepts. So for all that I've said, the semantic facts may entail that some phenomenal concept does indeed co-refer with some physical or functional concept that Alice and Bob know to pick out a property that Aurora does in fact have. Or it may be that no such concept refers in any such way. So I allow for the possibility that Aurora is in some sense straightforwardly right. And so Alice is straightforwardly right about Aurora, and that the proposition Aurora is G is just determinately true for some phenomenal concept G. Nonetheless, I claim because their disagreement is purely semantic, the moral standing that Aurora might have does not turn on who's right and who's wrong. So this is kind of the weakest part of the argument, I think. Largely, I just take it to be intuitively highly plausible that something's moral standing can't depend on who's right in a purely semantic disagreement. Insofar as I have an argument for this claim, it goes something like this. So I'm not totally persuaded that this is a valid or a sound argument. So I take it moral facts supervene on non-moral facts, and therefore I take it that someone's moral standing must be determined by the set of all non-moral facts that pertain to them. Now, if what I've argued so far is correct, it would seem that any proposition about Aurora that is stated in terms of phenomenal concepts, that serves merely to restate some fact about Aurora that could instead have been stated using purely physical or functional concepts. So no such proposition serves to introduce any genuinely new fact about Aurora. Therefore, it seems to stand to reason that Aurora's moral standing must already be fully determined by the facts on which Alice and Bob agree, and cannot hinge on any facts about which they disagree. Okay, so that's a sort of an attempt to get the initial argument on the table. Now I'm going to think about some reasons why you might reject the premises of the argument. We'll start with the first one. So as you remember, the first argument or the first premise says that the disagreement between Alice and Bob must be purely semantic, right? It's not about how things stand with Aurora, but how our concepts relate to how things stand with Aurora. I'm going to consider three ways in which you might try to reject this premise. The first approach I'll consider relies on rejecting the kind of property identity claims that were taken to follow from physicalism, right? This claim that every phenomenal property must be identified with some physical or functional property. That assumption obviously played a kind of key role in the argument because I assumed that Alice and Bob agreed on what physical and functional properties Aurora had. As I noted previously, there are other ways in which you could choose to understand the implications of physicalism for the metaphysics of consciousness. And so one way in which you might try to resist the argument is by insisting that actually phenomenal properties are not to be identified with physical or functional properties, although phenomenal properties are nonetheless consistent with physicalism because they relate to fundamental physical properties in terms of supervenience, grounding, constitution, realization, or whatever you like. Sort of different way to think about this is there's this sort of standard distinction that's drawn between reductive and non-reductive physicalism. So as it's usually understood, reductive physicalists are physicalists who identify mental properties, phenomenal properties with first-order physical properties, usually neurobiological properties. Non-reductive physicalists deny such an identity. They typically instead identify mental properties with functional properties. But you could imagine a version of non-reductive physicalism that also denies the identification of mental with functional properties. And indeed, we don't have to imagine, because there are such theories out there in the literature. But anyway, assuming a view of this kind cannot be ruled out a priori, common knowledge of the truth of physicalism for Alice and Bob needn't commit them to thinking that phenomenal properties have to be identical to a physical or functional property. And so their shared agreements about Aurora's physical and functional properties needn't rule out that they have genuine disagreement about what properties this system exhibits. So I think there are sort of two reasons why I'm skeptical that this will work. So one of them is just that insofar as Alice and Bob are intended as stand-ins for the kind of philosophers that I talked about in the introduction, it seems plausible to me that they ought to be construed as assuming that every phenomenal property is identical to some physical or functional property, even if that's not strictly required by the best interpretation of the thought that everything is ultimately physical. That's just because the philosophers who are involved in this debate seem to me, at least generally speaking, to commit themselves to some kind of neurobiologicalism or some kind of functionalism or computational functionalism, which would identify phenomenal properties with either physical properties or functional properties, respectively. Secondly, and more importantly, I think that even if we identify phenomenal properties with properties that are neither physical nor functional, according to some standard conception of what that means, so long as these properties are compatible with physicalism, it ought to remain plausible that Alice and Bob agree about whether or not Aurora exhibits these properties, in spite of disagreeing about whether or not Aurora is conscious. So consider, for example, the view I alluded to earlier, the non-reductive physicalist view proposed by Pereboom. So on this view, phenomenal properties are to be identified with compositional properties as opposed to functional properties. So in Pereboom's understanding, a compositional property is a property that characterizes the intrinsic structure of a system. That includes the intrinsic features of its parts, including their shape and their rigidity, and the relations of those parts to one another, including their spatial arrangement. So I think on this construal, compositional properties are not to be identified with functional properties, construed as second-order properties defined in terms of possession of some first-order property that plays some causal role. Plausibly functional properties are multiply realizable with respect to compositional properties on this view. Now, I think whether or not Pereboom succeeds in outlining a kind of plausible, non-functionalist, non-reductive physicalist theory about the nature of consciousness, it seems very implausible, given the way I described it, that the disagreement between Alice and Bob could be explained in terms of disagreement about the compositional properties of Aurora. So in light of our stipulations, it seems plausible that we could just assume that they do indeed have common knowledge of the system's intrinsic structure through their knowledge of the physical machinery on which the system runs. So they can be assumed to know that transistors are arranged thus and so, and memory registers are located here and here on the motherboard, and so on. Seems like whatever their disagreement is about, it's not about the system's compositional properties. And more generally, I think identifying phenomenal properties with properties that are neither physical nor functional is not going to help us to construe the disagreement between them as being genuinely extra-semantic unless it's really plausible that Alice and Bob, in spite of everything they agree about, might really disagree about whether the system has this kind of property. And I think that's kind of a tall order. So given the depth of the agreement that we've ascribed to them, it's mysterious, to me at least, what phenomenal properties could be insofar as they're supposed to be numerically distinct from any of the physical or functional or compositional properties that Alice and Bob agree on, whilst nonetheless not being metaphysically distinct from that class of properties in the way that dualists might believe them to be. Okay, I'll move on to the second idea. So rather than supposing that Alice and Bob might disagree about whether Aurora exhibits some class of properties with which phenomenal properties might be identified, we could try to contest the first premise of the semantic indifference argument by proposing that maybe their disagreement is sort of about the system's higher order properties, about the properties of the physical and functional properties that they agree the system has. And in particular, you could perhaps imagine that they disagree about the relative naturalness of these properties or their associated kinds. And if both assume that phenomenal properties are natural kind properties, well, that could explain why they have these disagreements. and their divergent beliefs about what our phenomenal concepts refer to could in turn be explained by this underlying disagreement about naturalness if you go in for the sort of popular view that more natural properties and relations are more eligible to be the reference of our predicate concepts. And I think to add further substance to the disagreement, we can appeal to this familiar idea that taxonomies whose groupings correspond to natural kinds contribute to the predictive and explanatory success of these sciences. So in some views, that's basically all there is to the naturalness of a natural kind. But whatever exactly you think, you could imagine that Alice and Bob agree, or they disagree rather, about whether the predictive and explanatory ambitions of the consciousness science is going to be helped or hindered by grouping together what's going on with aurora together with what's going on in conscious neural systems under the common label of phenomenal consciousness. So I think when you view it in this light, it seems pretty clear that the disagreement is not purely semantic. And I think this way of interpreting the disagreement also has the virtue that it does seem to map onto considerations that move at least some philosophers to assert or deny that consciousness can be realized in computers. So for example, in arguing that phenomenal consciousness should be identified with a particular kind of brain state, Jesse Prinz argues that mental kinds that map onto neural mechanisms are the most likely to have rich inductive potential and natural as opposed to nominal laws. Similarly, Jacob Howie suggests that in order to solve Bloch's harder problem of consciousness, in order to determine whether an android whose positronic brain shares certain high-level functional properties with my own, whether such an android is conscious or not, he suggests that what we ought to do is just consider whether we achieve the best explanatory integration of a wide range of phenomena by one grouping of properties rather than another. I nonetheless have some doubts about the idea that we can restore moral significance to the disagreement between Alice and Bob by interpreting it as a disagreement about the relative naturalness of the physical and functional properties or their associated kinds. So first and foremost, I think that when understood in these terms, the disagreement strikes me as most likely to be misguided. It strikes me as most likely that both are in error, and more likely still that both are being irrational. Okay, so why do I think this? So we've stipulated that aurora shares certain high-level functional properties with conscious neural systems, but doesn't share certain fine-grained functional properties and doesn't share certain physical properties. And there seems to be, to me, no compelling reason to suppose that these shared properties really have a higher degree of inductive and explanatory significance than the properties in terms of which these systems differ. Seems more plausible to be that neither is really privileged any more than, say, the class of endothermic animals is privileged with respect to the cross-cutting class of amniotes when it comes to the predictive and explanatory success of the biological sciences. So as Jeffrey Lee has noted in a paper arguing for conclusions quite similar to those in this talk, when we emphasize these shared high-level properties that can facilitate broader generalizations across a wider domain of objects, whereas emphasizing these less abstract, more fine-grained particulars, those provide a better understanding of the mechanisms that are operative in any given case. And I share Lee's sense that it seems doubtful that there's any fact of the matter about how to trade off these different explanatory advantages and disadvantages. Furthermore, I think even if there were some fact of the matter, it would seem premature at this point to take a stand on what it is. So if you consider this question of whether the predictive and explanatory success of consciousness science will be helped or will be hindered by grouping together what's going on with AI systems like Aurora with what's going on with conscious neural systems, surely the rational response is just to wait and see. By analogy, this explains the picture, by analogy, I think it was reasonable for European naturalists at the turn of the 19th century, naturalists like Joseph Banks, to just wait and see and get further evidence before classifying the first batch of incomplete platypus specimens as being birds or as mammals. So viewed in this respect, I think it would be natural to diagnose both Alice and Bob as irrationally confident in the disagreement, even if both are not strictly speaking in error. Here's a second reason, I think, to be concerned about the proposal that we can restore moral significance to the debate by treating it as a disagreement about the relative naturalness of these properties. So we're supposing at this point that for any physical or functional or compositional property with which a phenomenal property might be identified, Alice and Bob agree on whether Aurora exhibits that property, but they disagree about the relative naturalness of the properties that are in play. The question is, why should it matter morally which of these properties is more natural than the other? So suppose that in grouping what's going on with Aurora together with what's going on in conscious neural systems, our taxonomy better reflects the joints in nature. Or suppose the opposite. Why should that fact have any bearing on how we ought to treat Aurora? So I think probably part of my skepticism here derives from a kind of general skepticism about monistic theories and normative ethics and about naturalist realism in metaethics. So I find it very plausible that the objects in the extension of a given ethical concept typically cannot be unified under any unitary non-ethical relation of real similarity. For example, it strikes me that there is just a diversity of ways in which a given act could be wrong. It could be wrong because it breaks a promise, because it harms someone, because it fails to give sufficient weight to someone's welfare in light of a special relationship that you bear to them. Right, I think provided that we take common sense intuitions like this very seriously, it seems unlikely that all wrong acts will share some single, natural, non-ethical dimension of similarity. More generally, I think that since the goal of ethics is to tell us how we ought to live, and not to predict or explain our observations, it would just be extremely surprising if our ethical concepts turned out to line up with scientifically significant joints in nature. So you may not buy this picture, but I do. And if you do buy this picture, then I think you should think in general that the properties that ground different instances of the same moral property will tend to have no important non-ethical commonalities. If you try to state those commonalities in terms of non-ethical joint carving concepts, you generally end up with something that looks a little bit gruesome. And then the observation that a given property carves nature of the joints would seem in general to have little or no bearing on whether or not that property is a morally significant one. So in saying all this, I seem to be disagreeing with Geoffrey Lee, whose conclusions are otherwise quite similar to the ones for which I'm arguing. So in this paper, he discusses the moral significance of consciousness only relatively briefly in passing, but he does suggest that we think of ethical importance as attaching to consciousness in a way that depends on its natural significance. So for Lee, the moral significance of consciousness is supposed to be challenged by physicalism based on the assumption or belief that he has that the reference of our phenomenal concepts will turn out to be no more natural than other similar physical or functional properties that fall outside of the extension of any of our phenomenal concepts. And as I understand him, Lee would therefore change his mind about the bearing of physicalism on the moral significance of consciousness if it turned out that our phenomenal concepts did actually manage to pick out sort of uniquely joint carving physical or functional properties. By contrast, I think that I would not change my mind about this. I think there is nonetheless a sense in which the position that I'm setting out in this talk sort of is consistent with the core intuition to which Lee is appealing. So this is something like the intuition that the moral significance that we attach to consciousness depends on the implicit assumption that consciousness is something deeply, fundamentally different from everything else around it. It's just that the argument I'm discussing in this paper is suggesting that only something as fundamentally different as the kind of irreducibly phenomenal properties posited by dualists will do the trick. Okay, the final possibility I'll consider is that the disagreement between Alice and Bob should be understood as being, at bottom, a moral disagreement. So on this picture, their disagreement isn't about what non-ethical properties Aurora has, it's about the ethical significance of the properties that the system has. Since both of them may assume that phenomenal consciousness is a morally important property, that might explain why they disagree about whether the system is or is not conscious. And I think this idea that moral criteria might play a role in determining the extension of our phenomenal concepts seems like one that we ought to take seriously, so it's defended in this forthcoming paper by Goff. And yeah, I think it's kind of plausible that what properties we pick out via our phenomenal concepts, that might depend in part on our intention to refer to properties that we take to have some kind of ethical importance. Nonetheless, I think this way of interpreting the disagreement strikes me as sort of highly revisionary, at least insofar as Alice and Bob are supposed to be stand-ins for philosophers of the kind that I talked about in the introduction. That's just because these contemporary debates about whether phenomenal consciousness can be realized in conventional computer hardware don't seem to be presented as ethical disagreements. They seem to be presented as being disagreements about matters of descriptive fact. So I think if they really are ethical disagreements in disguise, then many people involved in those debates are probably confused about what it is they're disagreeing about, or else they've been trying to pull the wool over our eyes or something like that. And if the debate is really ultimately ethical, then probably the way in which people argue ought to change so as to better approximate methods of argument that are more appropriate to normative and applied ethics. And I also think this revisionism extends to the kind of moral significance the debate is supposed to have. So in that sense, I think the current proposal doesn't really challenge the conclusion of the semantic indifference argument. So this proposal that Alice and Bob are really engaged in a disagreement about Aurora's moral status, it ultimately sort of supports the claim for which I've been arguing, the claim that they're not disagreeing about the presence or absence of a property on which the moral standing of the system might depend. So on the present proposal, that's just because they're basically disagreeing straightforwardly about the system's moral standing, as opposed to disagreeing about the presence or absence of a more fundamental property that might bear on the system's moral standing. So whether or not this might be a sort of a reasonable way to challenge the first premise of the semantic indifference argument, I think the conclusion at which we end up is ultimately quite similar. All right, so now I'll talk about a couple of ways in which you might try to reject the second premise of the argument. That's the premise that says that if these disagreements are purely semantic, then they don't have the kind of moral significance that they're ordinarily taken to have. And I'm going to look at a couple of challenges to that claim that are going to rely on some disagreements or some analogies with some other kinds of disagreements that might also be thought of as purely semantic. The first one will be a sort of, a stock example from the literature on conceptual engineering. And it's a sort of a case that suggests that disagreements about what words mean sometimes do have a lot riding on them. So we're going to consider two affidavits that were filed by philosophers in the case of Halpern v. Canada AG. This was a landmark case, a suit in which 8 same-sex couples successfully challenged the common law definition of marriage in the Canadian legal system as requiring both a man and a woman. So one philosopher, Robert Stainton, submitted an affidavit in which he argued that it is part of the present meaning of the word marriage in our common tongue that it applies only to male-female conjugal unions, from which he concluded that it is a necessary truth that same-sex couples cannot marry. So in her counter-affidavit, Adèle Mercier dismissed Stainton's argument based on faulty reasoning, and she concluded that the term marriage can be extended in its reference without altering its meaning. Now, this disagreement between Stainton and Mercier seems to be purely semantic. It seems to be a disagreement about what the term marriage means. Nonetheless, there seems to be something very morally important at stake in this disagreement, and that might suggest that a purely semantic disagreement need not, in general, be without moral importance. So sometimes it really does matter quite a lot, morally speaking, how we ought to use a particular word or concept. So why couldn't it similarly be possible that although the disagreement between Alice and Bob is purely semantic, there might be a lot riding on it, morally speaking? Many things you could say in reply. So one thing you could say is just you could deny that this disagreement between Stainton and Mercier is really a purely semantic disagreement. So it's a shame that Herman's gone, but so he argues in this book that this sort of disagreement is not really a disagreement about what words do mean, but rather a disagreement about what words should mean. So if it seems like there's something morally important at stake, that's because this really is ultimately a moral disagreement. And as I've already noted, you could sort of interpret the disagreement between Alice and Bob in similar terms, but I've already talked about that, so I won't talk about it more. I think you can also argue that the analogy can be broken by just emphasizing the legal context in which the disagreement between Stainton and Mercier occurs. So I take it that courts have a duty to interpret and apply legal statutes that were not enacted by the legislature, and correct application of a statute in any given case is going to turn on what that statute actually means. And so when the wording of a statute is unclear, the duties of the court will depend on who's right and who's wrong in a purely semantic disagreement. So I think the legal setting creates this context in which existing word meanings really do bear on people's duties, because judges have special obligations to guide their decisions in accordance with certain kinds of semantic facts. By contrast, disagreements about whether consciousness can be realized in conventional computer hardware don't, at least not yet, occur in a legal setting. And I take it that their moral significance is not supposed to be derived from legal convention. So I take it these disagreements are supposed to be significant because they bear on the question of whether AI systems have moral standing, that is, whether they matter in their own right and for their own sake. And as it's usually understood, an individual's moral standing is supposed to give all moral agents reasons to respond to that system in various ways, independent of any special obligations that might depend on relationships or roles. Consider a different kind of analogy that might be used to challenge the second response. So here's the setup. A murderer is on the loose. Morse and Lewis are working hard to determine the identity of the Oxford Ripper. Morse thinks that it's Professor Malcolm. Lewis disagrees, and they otherwise agree on the facts of the case. It might be suggested by the criteria I set out earlier, this is a semantic disagreement, right? So Morse and Lewis, in some sense, disagree about whether Professor Malcolm and the Oxford Ripper are one and the same, but everyone is self-identical, and even Lewis knows that. So in line with a kind of metalinguistic approach to Frege's puzzle, you might think that their disagreement must be semantic in that what they disagree about is the following. Morse thinks that the name, the Oxford Ripper, and the name Professor Malcolm, they co-refer, whereas Lewis disagrees about that. Nonetheless, it seems clear that this disagreement is not morally insignificant, right? If Morse is right, Professor Malcolm ought to be locked up. If Lewis is right, that would be a terrible injustice. So why couldn't it similarly be true that although Alice and Bob are really only disagreeing about which concepts co-refer, their disagreement might nonetheless be very morally significant? Well, I think the analogy fails in this case again. So presumably, Morse and Lewis don't only disagree about whether the name the Oxford Ripper and the name Professor Malcolm co-refer. They presumably also disagree about such facts as whether Professor Malcolm has killed anyone, or whether the person who murdered the porter on Sunday night gave a boring lecture about Thucydides on Monday morning. I take it that a salient fact about a name like the Oxford Ripper is that it can be assumed to be associated with a contingent reference-fixing condition, namely that it refers to the murderer, whoever that might be. As such, the contingent fact that the Oxford Ripper is the murderer is something that I assume can be known a priori, and we can easily explain why identifying someone as the Oxford Ripper is highly informative about how they ought to be treated. By contrast, I assume, in light of Kripke's arguments against the identity theory, that there's a strong pressure on physicalists and everyone else for that matter to deny that phenomenal concepts like pain pick out physical or functional properties by means of contingent reference-fixing conditions. Right? Intuitively, our phenomenal concepts pick out their reference in some sense directly or in virtue of what it's like to be in the corresponding state, as opposed to via any distinct reference-fixing concept. Now, I think we can admittedly imagine a case where Lewis and Morse disagree about whether the Oxford Ripper names Professor Malcolm, although they don't disagree about whether Professor Malcolm has killed anyone. So maybe, for example, Lewis has developed this like crackpot semantic theory on which the name the Oxford Ripper has come to refer to someone who left their fingerprints at the scene of the crime in spite of being perfectly innocent. And for this reason, he contests Morse's identification because he thinks the Oxford Ripper names someone innocent, but Professor Malcolm is guilty. So in this case, I think this is also just the sort of case where it seems like the moral significance of the disagreement has become lost. All right. Suppose, implausibly, that you are convinced. You are convinced that if physicalism provides the correct metaphysics of consciousness, then the moral standing of AI systems doesn't turn on who's wrong and who's right in contemporary theoretical disagreements about whether phenomenal consciousness can be realized in conventional computer hardware. What follows? So one possibility would be to just treat this as an argument against physicalism, right? You might think it surely does matter, and indeed does matter enormously, whether an AI system really feels pain or instead feels nothing at all. And if physicalists would have us believe otherwise, then so much the worse for them. Like the moral significance of consciousness is just a kind of obvious bedrock fact for us. So I do have some sympathy for this line of reasoning, but I do also worry that it amounts to a kind of wishful thinking. So if we're rejecting physicalism because it degrades the moral significance of consciousness, we seem to be revising our conception of what the world is like in order to make it more hospitable to our values. And that seems in general like a poor way of reasoning. So suppose that you are convinced by the semantic indifference argument and you also are convinced to remain loyal to physicalism. So then you detach the consequence you conclude that these theoretical disagreements about whether consciousness can be realized in conventional computer hardware, they don't actually bear on the moral standing of AI systems. What follows then? So I think one natural thought is that this strengthens the case in favor of otherwise relatively unpopular views, I think, on which the presence or absence of phenomenal consciousness does not in fact bear on the moral standing of any entity. So for example, you could have a view where moral standing derives from being a welfare subject. Being a welfare subject depends on the satisfaction of preferences, and we can characterize preferences and the value of their satisfaction in ways that make no essential reference to phenomenal consciousness, a view of that kind. I think there's also a second gloomier possibility. So rather than any heterodox theory about the basis of moral standing, the argument might be taken to call the entire moral enterprise into question. That is, it might be thought to strengthen the case for nihilism. After all, we might wonder if the presence or absence of phenomenal consciousness, if that doesn't matter morally speaking, how could anything at all matter morally speaking? So I've got some sympathy for each of these three reactions. Finally, here's just something else you might wonder. So my discussion is focused very much on these theoretical disagreements about whether consciousness can be realized in conventional computer hardware. I've tried to stick somewhat close to the sort of contours of that debate, but there are obviously all kinds of other debates about the presence or absence of consciousness at various cases at the edge of sentience. And so you might be wondering to what extent the claims for which I've argued here generalize to how we should think about other disagreements about consciousness, like disagreements about presence of consciousness in fish or in insects. Now, you may be surprised to learn that I actually think they probably do so poorly. I mean, on the one hand, I should say I don't know that much about these debates, so this is to some extent guesswork. But to my knowledge, these debates about the presence or absence of phenomenal consciousness in fish or in insects, they generally don't occur in spite of agreements about the structure and functional organization of the nervous systems of fish and insects, and the ways in which the nervous systems of fish and insects are like and unlike those of the mammalian species that all parties to the disagreement agree are conscious. If so, that would suggest that these disagreements are importantly unlike the disagreement that I sketched between Alice and Bob, and the same kind of argument couldn't be given for thinking that the disagreement is purely semantic. So for all I've argued, whatever physical or functional properties of the nervous systems of fish and insects are in dispute in these debates, that could be the key to their moral standing. And that's all I've got. Thank you.